And so, moving along in the Sloterdijk discussion here to Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is entitled Between Faces, on the Appearance of the Interfacial Intimate Sphere. And so, what this chapter is basically is a response to Deleuze and Guattari's chapter in A Thousand Plateaus on faciality. So this is going to be Sloterdijk's version of faciality. And what he's going to discuss is the emergence of the interfacial intimate sphere. Now, if we review briefly what D&G had said about faciality, they had said there that in the 4 different signifying regimes, each of those regimes has its own faciality. The pre-signifying tribal machine, the faciality there is the mask, the tribal apparition, and then in the signifying despotic Bronze Age regime, the facial signifier there is that of the despot, who is conflated with the God image and is looking directly at you. Then with the nomadic war machine, we don't really have the counter-signifying regime of the nomadic war machine. We don't really have a face, but we do in the Hebrew passional post-signifying regime of signs where the face is turned away in profile. And so those are the basically 3 different kinds of faciality there. Now you'll note that what's missing from that account of faciality is precisely the image of 2 faces staring together or locked into a microsphere, an interfacial intimate microsphere, as Sloterdijk will call it. And so he has decided to supplement that discussion with his own history of the emergence of faciality in human history with this idea of interfaciality. And he begins his discussion by talking about some of Giotto's images. Giotto was painting around the time that Dante was living in 1300. And he specifically focuses on these paintings, the legend of St. Joachim meeting at the Golden Gate, meeting Anne. Joachim and Anne are the parents of Mary, and they are meeting at the Golden Gate after Joachim has been exiled from the city for reasons of sterility, and he has gone and made a deal with God that Anne will be able to be impregnated with Mary, and so he goes back to the gate. And the image here that Giotto paints is St. Anne welcoming him in front of a crowd of spectators back to the city. This is Sloterdijk's illustration of Giotto being welcomed back in the gate. You can hardly see it there. But there's a close-up illustration in which you can see the interfacial bubble there that Giotto has painted in the kiss that is given by St. Anne to Joachim. Together they form a microsphere. The 2 halos around them join together to form a single bubble. And so that forms a basic microsphere, an intimate interfacial relationship that is the basic dyadic unit, the human dyadic spherical unit. And you can also see, as Sloterdijk points out, that there's a 3rd face emerging between the 2 of them. It's difficult to make out in this image that I'm holding up, but if you look it up online, you'll see it better. But there is a 3rd face creepily emerging from the interfacial sphere between the 2 of them, as though that sphere were already giving birth to what will eventually be the Christ child, who will emerge out of this interfacial sphere. Basically, the 3rd face that comes into being there will become the kind of faciality that will be painted all throughout the metaphysical age of the European West, which has produced more images of faces, I think, individual faces, than in any other tradition in the world. So that's that microsphere. And then he contrasts it with Giotto's image of the kiss of Judas, where Judas comes to give the treacherous kiss. And we note there the opposite, that the contrast between Judas and Christ in this image is such to represent and emphasize the cleavage between them. There's a rupture there. Christ is in the sphere. He's in the microsphere that he has composed with his disciples, and Judas is rupturing it with this betrayal, this bestial, greedy, animal-like aspect. And you can see that Christ is giving him a kind of a cold shoulder there. Basically, Christ has exiled Judas from his microsphere. And so Judas is now in the role of a spherological exile, and Christ is the one who is the world-forming sphere former in that image. So he contrasts these 2 images as 2 different images of interfaciality, one in which a microsphere forms and the other in which it's ruptured by the individual who doesn't fit, the interloper, the one who doesn't belong in the microsphere. These become constitutive images that gradually give rise to the West tradition of the painting of the portrait study. Now, the portrait study is, of course, an iconotype unto itself. These images that we're seeing here are what I would call Christian iconotypes, the Nativity, Last Supper, any traditional Christian image that's been repeated and represented as a formulaic convention over and over again is an iconotype. But, and as Sloterdijk says in this, the great facial iconotype is, of course, the image of Christ, the face of Christ, as D&G also say in A Thousand Plateaus, the face of Christ or the face of Mary. These are the iconotypes that give birth in Western European art to the painting of the individual visage as a singularity. So that in the metaphysical age, the portrait study is itself an iconotype. The genre of the portrait study is an iconotype of the metaphysical age. But the individual portraits that are rendered within it are not iconotypes. In fact, they rupture and break with all traditional iconotypical conventions whatsoever. It's no longer the idea of this or that individual being an incarnation of a pre-existent archetype, Platonic, a theory of Platonic matching, but rather the individual is forced to acknowledge, or the viewer of the painting is forced to acknowledge this individual as a singularity. And so we have produced all of these individuals in our metaphysical portrait studies as singularities unto themselves, and so we have ruptured from the tradition of the iconotype, the portrait study as the iconotype. And then he comes up with a term here that he calls protraction. And by protraction he means the gradual production of the face from the animal. And he means this in both a biological evolutionary sense. Through the history of human evolution, the face has gradually been produced, and especially the pleasing, joyful, beautiful face has been sexually selected. It's been part of the process of anthropogenesis, what he calls anthropogenesis, the production of human society, to sexually select out those faces with which one wants to reproduce more beautiful visages, so that the beautiful visage has been sexually selected and produced over time out of the animal background. And so this theory of protraction is basically opposite to D&G's theory of becoming animal. This is becoming human, not becoming animal, the production of the face. But it's also cultural insofar as the face is produced from out of as a singularity, as an individual three-dimensional face, is also produced from out of the background of the iconotypical face, the conventionalized visage that has been typical of all the other civilizations in history. For example, he talks in this chapter about the faciality of Asia. Basically in Asia there's only one face. It's the face of the Buddha. And all the images of all the kings who are sculpted in the statues are plugged into the iconotype of the Buddha with eyes closed and a joyful, suffering transcending smile on the face of the visage, so that every individual is absorbed and disappears into the mask, into the iconotype of the Buddha in Asia, so that they don't have a tradition of the production of the face as a singularity in Asia the way we have done so in the West. And so then he moves on to discuss how also in the West, he mentions that in the history of civilization, the faciality, the signifier of the face, is typically a masculine visage, and the female visage has been hidden for the most part, with the exception of the Mary visages in European art. It's been mostly a masculine affair, that faciality has been typified and defined by the appearance of the masculine face. And especially if you look back into the Paleolithic and the Neolithic at the images of the goddess's face is never represented. It's always the emphasis is always put on the body. The emphasis is on the breast and the vulva and the buttocks and the belly, everything except the face. So the signifier of the female visage has been missing in art up to the advent of civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt, when the goddess begins to get a face. She acquires a face in images of Isis in Egypt or in images of Inanna and Ishtar in Mesopotamia. The face then appears, but it's still a typified and conventionalized face in that case. But she tends to take a backseat to the male visage, which has tended to typify the emergence and production of faciality throughout Western history. And then he talks about the decline in modernist art and contemporary art, the decline of faciality, the decline of the portrait into what he calls the détrait, or in which there is a detraction or abstraction of the facial features in modernist art, where the codes of the facial features are scrambled so that they become asignifying. and the face is rearranged, and it's no longer interfacially involved with another visage, but is either staring directly out at a camera, as in the visages of Andy Warhol, or as in the paintings of Francis Bacon, it's been scrambled, and you simply have the monstrous or inhuman visage, but it's no longer a portrait. It's a détrait. It has detracted from the beauty and joy of the visage, and so that's what we've gotten in modern art. And then he also says that it's not an accident that European civilization is the one civilization that has produced the largest profusion of human faces, and it's also the civilization that introduced the mirror. The mirror is something that came out of Western optics. It was perfected by the West. It came out of Western optics, and the bourgeois individual of the Baroque age is the individual whose house is surrounded by mirrors. And the mirror, though, Sloterdijk says, is a pseudo-image that gives the aristocrat or the individual of the bourgeois looking into it a pseudo-image that gives the false sense of an interfacial microspheric completion. The individual surrounded by the mirror believes that he has completed his faciality, his interfacial bipolar relationship with the image, but it's of course a false image. And so these individuals paradoxically become lonely, isolated individuals, and so we have this tradition of the portrait study of the single, lonesome individual staring out, surrounded by basically nothing but him or herself. And Sloterdijk then doesn't go into this, but I think he should have, which is that the logical sequel to this is the cult of the celebrity, where the celebrity has simply taken this process of surrounding him or herself with the mirror to the nth degree. The video camera and electronic circuitry is basically the mirror with electricity sent running through it. And the celebrity is the one who has surrounded himself with these electronic mirrors, and is the one who is even more isolated than anyone else on the planet, paradoxically, by virtue of the fact that he has surrounded and amplified his own consciousness with replicated images of himself, avatars, that have had the paradoxical effect actually of further and further removing him from the stream of humanity and cutting him off from interfacial relationships with other human beings. For Sloterdijk, the human being always is involved in a relationship, in at least a bipolar relationship with another human being. There's always a loop there. And when that physical human being is missing, synthetic and prosthetic individuals will be plugged in, as in the case of the mirror, or nowadays with the celebrity, the electronic mirror, that is plugged in to complete the loop, the feedback loop that gives the individual the illusion of completion, but which really is, it just further serves to isolate the individual. He doesn't mention this about the celebrity, but I think he should have. He should have taken it into that. That's basically the upshot of the chapter and his history of interfaciality. And we note that whereas the previous chapter had been concerned with the heart, this chapter is concerned with the optical phenomenon of the face. So we've moved up, as it were, from the fourth chakra to the fifth and sixth chakras of the head and the face. And he's continuing to explore the interior of the human psyche, the actual way in which the human psyche interiorizes others, other phenomena, other entities, especially other human beings. And it's a hollow interior, as we have seen from the previous chapter. It's a hollow interior that works by interiorizing and incorporating other individuals into them. And it's not done by reading. Certain individuals on the internet have suggested that this is basically just a silly and overly complex way of stating that reading is the process of interiorizing the individual. It is not. That is a different process than what Sloterdijk is talking about here. He's talking about the process of human relationships, how human beings form microspheres by connecting and hooking in to the psyches of other human beings. So it has to do with the process of incorporating another individual inside you and you inside them in a psychological sense, not necessarily in a physical sense. And it's depicted in literature in somatized metaphors of, for example, the story that we saw before about eating and consuming the heart as a substitute for the Eucharist. So there's a somatization process that goes on in which thoughts and ideas are depicted in literature and images as having a somatic basis. David Cronenberg's film The Brood is a classic example of this, where the woman Nola is taught by the psychotherapist to incarnate her rage in productions that bud off from her body of children that are extensions of her rage and that go out and carry out her violent wishes by killing and murdering those others that she has rage against. That's a process of somatization that's similar to what Sloterdijk is talking about here, whereby thoughts become somatized in the imagery of literature, film, and myth, and so forth. So that's that chapter.